Hello, this is video lesson number 22 for Thursday, June 4th. Last video lesson, you learned about compromises that were made between northern and southern states between the years 1820 and 1850, particularly the Compromise of 1820 and the Compromise of 1850. We learned that a compromise is where one side gives up some of what they want to get most of what they want. For years, compromises seemed to work between the North and South with the issue of slavery, but eventually compromise just didn't work anymore. As both sides became more entrenched in their views, they became less likely to compromise. Because they were no longer even trying to compromise, the situation just got worse and worse between the North and South. And this next section of the chapter is titled A Nation Dividing. And in this section, we're going to see how a couple laws served to divide the nation between northern and southern states and pro-slavery and anti-slavery forces instead of bringing the nation together or helping resolve issues. So the first controversial law we're going to talk about is the Fugitive Slave Act. The Fugitive Slave Act was actually part of the Compromise of 1850. It was extremely controversial. What it was a law that required all citizens of the United States, including the North, to help assist in catching runaway slaves. The South thought this was a great idea. They figured lots of slaves were escaping. These slaves are property. They should get their property back. And the North should also help them get their property back. The South thought that this law would force the North to recognize the institution of slavery. But that's not what happened at all. Instead, Northerners were infuriated, meaning extremely angry, and more became convinced that slavery was wrong than were convinced before this law was passed. Needless to say, it was a controversial law. There were cases where Southern slave catchers were overly aggressive in looking for escaped slaves and sometimes kidnapped free African Americans from the North and sold them into slavery. When stories like this spread through the North, people became so against the law that there was widespread resistance to it. The vast majority of Northerners simply refused to follow the law or cooperate in any way. In fact, more Northerners started to help runaway slaves and join abolitionist groups. So you could say the law backfired for the South. And naturally, as you can imagine, when the South found out what was happening, in other words, when they found out that Northerners were not obeying a law that said they had to help catch escaped slaves, the South became even more angry at the North. The second controversial law I mentioned is the Kansas-Nebraska Act. This was a law that allowed people in the Kansas and Nebraska territories to vote on whether or not they could have slavery in their state, in their territory, and then eventually these territories would become states. Now, what was interesting about this law is that, it sounds like, hey, this is really fair. Just let people decide. But if you remember, in 1820, a compromise was made that said that any territory north of the 36-degree 30 line had to be a free territory. Any territory below that 36-degree 30 line would end up being a slave territory. Well, Kansas and Nebraska were both above that line. So by allowing people to vote on slavery, and by having any slavery there, it would have violated the Missouri Compromise. So this was really one of the beginnings of compromises going right out the window. The Kansas-Nebraska Act was narrowly passed in Congress after bitter debate, but after it was passed, it pretty much sent a signal that any compromises, any rules that were made ahead of time, in other words, in years before this, were pretty much thrown out the window. And the arguments became more bitter, And now both sides were trying to get their way without any compromise whatsoever. This would eventually lead to conflict in Kansas. After passage of the act, pro and anti-slavery forces from outside of Kansas started rushing into Kansas. When they ended up having the vote on whether or not to have slavery in Kansas, there were only 1,500 voters living in Kansas. But when they actually had the vote, 6,000 ballots were cast. Because the election was inaccurate, they ended up having multiple elections. There was cheating in these elections. There were people who were armed who prevented other people from voting if they thought that those people would vote the way they didn't want to. A group of people called Border Ruffians, who were armed pro-slavery supporters, came in from Missouri and started harassing and intimidating people. Eventually, two governments were created in Kansas, a pro-slavery government and an anti-slavery government. But things got out of control when 800 pro-slavery supporters attacked and destroyed the city of Lawrence, Kansas. Lawrence, Kansas was the capital of the anti-slavery government. Anti-slavery people then armed and formed groups and sought retaliation and started attacking pro-slavery settlements. Also in this time, a radical abolitionist named John Brown makes a name for himself when he, his sons, and a few other supporters brutally murder 5 supporters of slavery. The violence gets so out of hand that the President of the United States at the time needs to send soldiers to calm the territory down. And it's only after thousands of U.S. soldiers are sent to Kansas that the people stop fighting. But many people today say Kansas was a preview of the American Civil War. It was like a mini Civil War in the Kansas territory. And it ended up getting a nickname. At the time, it was called Bleeding Kansas, because stories of the violence in Kansas were on the front page of the newspaper virtually every day. And after a while, newspapers across the United States called the area Bleeding Kansas because of all the violence and death. But sadly, the violence wouldn't just be in Kansas. A shocking event happened right in Washington, D.C., in the halls of Congress, when a northern senator named a northern House of Representative member named Charles Sumner gave a very critical speech of slavery. And in the speech, he criticized and insulted a representative from South Carolina multiple times. Days later, he returned to the House chamber, and it was full of mostly Southern delegates and Southern slavery supporters. And in the group was a relative of the representative he had insulted previously in his speech. That guy's name is Preston Brooks. And Preston Brooks, who was a Southerner, walked right up to Charles Sumner, took out his walking stick, and beat him severely with it, knocking him on the ground, knocking him unconscious. And again, this was a shocking act. We had violence in our own halls of Congress. So Section 2 really focused on those key points that I mentioned. That's Section 2 of Chapter 15. Tonight or today, whenever you do your distance learning lesson, you want to read Chapter 15, Section 2, answer the questions that are attached on the classroom page, and then watch the video links related to the Kansas-Nebraska Act and Bleeding Kansas. With that said, have a good weekend. Make sure you get these things done by, Tuesday next week. And see you at the next video lesson. Bye-bye.